Have you ever felt that peculiar unease that arises when you realize you're seeing the world differently from those around you? When your reflections on life, on the meaning of things, on what truly matters, seem out of place in everyday conversations about work, consumption, and entertainment, this feeling of intellectual isolation is not just your imagination or a sign of arrogance. It is an inevitable and rarely discussed consequence of personal growth and the development of critical awareness. There is an emotional cost we pay when we expand our understanding of the world, and this cost is seldom mentioned in motivational speeches about self-development. For millennia, human beings lived in small, homogeneous communities where knowledge, beliefs, and perspectives were widely shared. The medieval farmer didn't worry about having intellectually stimulating conversations because everyone around him had roughly the same level of information and cultural references. The village functioned as a large collective brain where each individual was a cell thinking similarly to the others. There was comfort in this cognitive uniformity, a sense of belonging that naturally arose from the convergence of perspectives, the knowledge revolution that began during the Renaissance and accelerated dramatically in recent centuries fundamentally changed this dynamic. For the first time in human history, it became possible for individuals to accumulate levels of knowledge and develop perspectives that significantly distanced them from their peers. What should have been a liberation paradoxically turned into a subtle form of social exile. The more a person learns, the further they drift from the common experience shared by most people. This phenomenon has intensified exponentially in the digital age. Today, we have access to an amount of information that would be inconceivable to any previous generation. We can study philosophy with the greatest thinkers in history, understand the mechanisms of human psychology, explore the frontiers of science and technology, all without leaving home. But this cognitive privilege comes with an emotional cost that is rarely acknowledged. Every book we read, every insight we develop, every layer of complexity we add to our understanding of the world distances us a little further from the shared experience of the majority. The situation becomes even more complex when we consider that deep self-knowledge often reveals uncomfortable truths about ourselves and the society we live in. When we begin to question dominant narratives about success, happiness, and fulfillment, when we develop the ability to see through the collective illusions that sustain social cohesion, we inevitably drift away from the shallow conversations that make up most of everyday social interaction. Imagine trying to explain to someone who has never deeply reflected on the nature of human consciousness why you feel disconnected from the endless pursuit of status and material possessions. How do you convey the perception that many of the things society considers fundamentally important are in fact arbitrary cultural constructs? How do you share the understanding that the very idea of a fixed permanent self is a cognitive illusion when the person next to you is fully invested in maintaining and promoting that illusion? This disconnection doesn't occur only on the intellectual level. It permeates interpersonal relationships in subtle but profound ways. You find yourself censoring your thoughts in casual conversations, simplifying your perspectives to avoid discomfort, pretending interest in topics you find trivial. A kind of double consciousness develops where you maintain a public, palatable version of yourself while your deeper reflections remain private territory. The problem worsens when we realize this situation is neither temporary nor easily resolved. We cannot simply unlearn what we've discovered about ourselves and the world. Knowledge is irreversible. Once you see the invisible structures that govern human behavior, you can't pretend they don't exist. Once you develop sensitivity to the contradictions and paradoxes of the human condition, you can no longer settle for simplistic, comforting explanations. Let me pause for a moment and ask you directly, do you also feel this tension between personal growth and social connection? This feeling that the more you understand about yourself and the world, the harder it becomes to find people who share this same depth of reflection? I know it might sound like elitism or arrogance to express this, but many of us carry this weight in silence, believing we're the only ones experiencing this particular form of intellectual loneliness. If this feeling resonates with you, share your experience in the comments. It can be as simple as writing, "I feel this isolation when I realize that." Your honesty might help others understand they're not alone in this experience of growth, accompanied by distance. The irony is that we live in an age of unprecedented connectivity, yet many of the most conscious and self-aware people report increasing levels of existential loneliness. Social media allows us to connect with millions of people, but how many of those connections offer the kind of depth and authenticity that an expanded consciousness naturally seeks? Most digital communication remains superficial, perpetuating the same dynamics of social performance and external validation that self-knowledge gradually teaches us to question. This paradox reflects a fundamental tension between individual development and social cohesion that has always existed, but has become particularly acute in modernity. Traditional societies had built-in mechanisms for dealing with individuals who developed different perspectives or deep insights into the nature of reality. Shamans, sages, mystics, and philosophers held socially recognized roles that allowed their unique perspectives to be valued without threatening the stability of the community. In contemporary society, those traditional roles have vanished or been marginalized. We lack adequate social structures to integrate people who have developed levels of self-knowledge that distance them from the common experience. The result is that these people often feel like foreigners in their own culture, external observers of social dynamics in which they can no longer participate naturally. The issue becomes even more complicated when we realize that the kind of self-knowledge that generates this isolation often includes the insight that the very search for connection and belonging is, in a sense, a form of emotional dependency. When you understand the psychological mechanisms that drive us to seek external validation and social approval, it becomes difficult to engage in these behaviors with the same innocence as before. But this awareness doesn't eliminate the fundamental human need for connection. It only makes satisfying that need more complex and problematic. There's also a temporal dimension to this paradox that's rarely discussed. Deep self-awareness often involves a long-term perspective that sharply contrasts with the short-term focus that characterizes most contemporary social life. When you develop the ability to see historical patterns over time, when you understand how social and technological changes operate on scales of decades or centuries, it becomes difficult to engage with the artificial urgency dominating public discourse on current events. This expanded temporal perspective can create a kind of chronological dislocation where you feel like you're living at a different pace from the rest of society. The issues dominating 24-hour news cycles seem trivial when viewed through the lens of long-term historical processes. The anxieties consuming most people's emotional energy seem rooted in a limited understanding of the true challenges facing humanity. But perhaps the most challenging aspect of this paradox is the gradual realization that the very idea of solving or overcoming this dilemma may be fundamentally flawed. The isolation that accompanies deep self-awareness may not be a problem to be fixed, but an inevitable feature of the growth of human consciousness. Accepting this reality requires a fundamental redefinition of what it means to live a connected and meaningful life. One possible perspective is to understand that there are different types of human connection and that quantity is not necessarily more important than quality. Perhaps it's better to have a few relationships characterized by depth, authenticity, and mutual understanding than many superficial connections based on social conformity. This shift from quantity to quality can help transform isolation from a deprived experience into one of conscious selection. There is also the possibility that the isolation associated with self-awareness is temporary, a necessary transitional phase in the evolution of human consciousness. As more people go through similar processes of personal growth and expanded perspective, perhaps a new form of community will gradually emerge, one based not on uniformity of beliefs and perspectives, but on a shared capacity to navigate complexity and ambiguity. The digital revolution, despite contributing to the problem, also offers potential tools for its resolution. For the first time in history, people with similar perspectives can find each other regardless of geographic location. Virtual communities based on deep intellectual and philosophical affinities are emerging, offering spaces where people who've undergone similar journeys of self-knowledge can connect and exchange experiences. But perhaps the most important transformation is internal. The process of accepting and integrating the isolation that accompanies personal growth may itself be a profound form of consciousness development. When we stop resisting this reality and begin to explore it with curiosity rather than resentment, we discover that solitude can be a source of creativity, insight, and spiritual growth. The enforced solitude of self-knowledge can function like a kind of involuntary retreat, where we are confronted with aspects of ourselves and of reality that we would normally avoid through constant social engagement. This confrontation, though uncomfortable, can lead to even deeper levels of understanding and acceptance. There is a crucial difference between loneliness and solitude that becomes particularly relevant in this context. Loneliness is the experience of being alone against our will, a feeling of deprivation and disconnection. Solitude is the ability to be alone in a productive and enriching way, a condition that allows for types of reflection and creativity that are impossible in the midst of social life. The journey of self-knowledge can be seen as a gradual process of transforming loneliness into solitude. This doesn't mean the need for human connection disappears, but that it becomes more selective and conscious. Instead of seeking connection as a form of escape from self-confrontation, you learn to value relationships that expand and enrich your understanding rather than simply offer emotional comfort. This perspective requires a fundamental re-evaluation of what success means in human relationships. Instead of measuring the quality of our social lives by the number of interactions or ease of social integration, we might begin to value them based on the depth of mutual understanding and the capacity for shared growth they provide. The question becomes even more interesting when we consider that this pattern of isolation through knowledge may be a necessary evolutionary phenomenon. Perhaps this is how human consciousness develops, through individuals who temporarily distance themselves from dominant norms and perspectives to explore new ways of understanding and experiencing reality. These pioneers of consciousness experience the emotional cost of being ahead of their time, but they also have the privilege of contributing to the gradual expansion of human understanding. Their discoveries, insights, and perspectives eventually spread through the broader culture, paving the way for future generations to reach similar levels of self-awareness without the same degree of isolation. This historical perspective offers a way to contextualize and give meaning to the personal experience of isolation. Instead of seeing it simply as an unfortunate cost of personal growth, we can understand it as a contribution to a larger evolutionary process that is gradually raising the level of consciousness of the human species. But even accepting this broader perspective, the practical question remains: how to navigate everyday life when you feel disconnected from the concerns and priorities that dominate the experience of most people around you. One possible approach is to develop what we might call social bilingualism, the ability to communicate at different levels of depth depending on the context and the needs of the people involved. This does not mean being fake or manipulative, but recognizing that different situations require different types of communication. Just as you wouldn't speak to a child the same way you would speak to an academic colleague, you can learn to adjust your level of communication without sacrificing your fundamental authenticity. This skill requires practice and discernment. It involves learning to identify when it is worthwhile to share deeper perspectives and when it is more appropriate to keep conversations at more superficial levels. It also requires developing the patience and compassion necessary to interact with people who have not yet undergone similar processes of questioning and growth. Paradoxically, this ability to navigate different levels of communication can in itself be an advanced form of self-knowledge. It demands a sophisticated understanding of both yourself and others, as well as the emotional flexibility needed to find value and meaning in different types of human interaction. Perhaps the most liberating insight is the realization that the problem lies neither in you nor in others, but in the cultural expectation that all human relationships must operate at the same level of depth and intimacy. Just as we have different types of physical needs that are met by different types of activities, perhaps we have different types of social and intellectual needs that require different types of relationships. If these reflections have touched something you've been feeling, but perhaps hadn't yet found words to express, know that you are not alone. By subscribing to the channel, you will connect with a growing community of people who share your concerns and your desire for a deeper understanding of the philosophical challenges of our time. Each week, we gather here to explore together the great questions that define our era and to seek not only understanding, but also wiser ways of living amid the transformations we are witnessing. This is not just a channel, but a space for dialogue and collective growth. Join us on this ongoing journey. Subscribe so we can continue this essential conversation about how to live with more wisdom and purpose in a world that often leaves us disoriented and divided. The journey of self-knowledge, with all its challenges and paradoxes, remains one of the most valuable adventures a human being can undertake. The isolation that sometimes accompanies this journey can be seen not as a punishment for growth, but as a sign that you are moving toward more authentic and deeper forms of existence. And perhaps, in the end, we will discover that true human connection does not happen despite our differences and complexities, but precisely through them.
Every year, more than 1 million people die all over the world in car accidents. Most of them are caused by human error, like people drinking and then driving or falling asleep at the wheel or whatever. Self-driving vehicles are likely to save about 1 million lives every year. This is amazing. You think about climate change. So yes, developing the AIs will consume a lot of energy, but they could also find new sources of energy, new ways to harness energy that could be our best shot at preventing ecological collapse. So there is enormous positive potential. We shouldn't deny that. We should be aware of it. And on the other hand, it's very difficult to appreciate the dangers because the dangers, again, they are kind of alien.
I would assume that us having more information and more access to information would lead to more truth, less conspiracy, more agreement. But that doesn't seem to be the case.
No, not at all. Most information in the world is junk. It's like with food. There was a time, like a century ago in many countries, where food was scarce. So people ate whatever they could get, especially it was full of fat and sugar. And they thought that more food is always good. Like if you ask your great-grandmother, she would say, yes, more food is always good. And then we reach a time of abundance. And we have all this industrialized processed food, which is artificially full of fat and sugar and salt and whatever. And it's obviously bad for us. The idea that more food is always good, no. And definitely not all this junk food. And the same thing has happened with information.
What I try to do in all my works is help people understand themselves, help people understand reality better. It's a very delicate job because people usually rush to judge reality and to judge history, to judge the past and the present. We want to know who are the good guys and who are the bad guys, whether things are good or bad. When we rush to judge things, we don't have time to understand them. In my writing, I try to write history without villains, without good guys and bad guys, but to understand the deep process of change. And I sometimes think about history maybe as a kind of collective therapy.